spring saw events that had implications across the world, from a new pope being elected to another crisis over North Korea. It was all go at the start of the year. But we begin first in the fall, when one of the most powerful storms on record left a trail of death and destruction across the Philippines. The Philippines gets its fair share of tropical storms every year, but November saw it devastated by a typhoon of epic proportions. Super Typhoon Haiyan slammed into the central Philippines, leaving a trail of death and destruction in its wake. It was one of the most powerful storms on record and left towns and cities in ruins. Thousands of people were killed or injured, while tens of thousands more were left homeless.
We are hungry. We don't have any food.
As the scale of the disaster became clear, nations around the world rushed aid to the worst affected areas. But a week after the disaster, many complained that medicine, food, and water was still in short supply. There were reports that law and order had broken down, while bodies lay unclaimed on the streets of towns and cities. The cleanup and salvage operation is expected to take months and cost the Philippines billions of dollars. Elsewhere in Southeast Asia, Thailand endured another political crisis. Thai Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra was forced to dissolve parliament in December after weeks of anti-government protests threatened new instability in the country. Thousands of demonstrators fought police and occupied government buildings in downtown Bangkok in a bid to force Yingluck to step down. Earlier in the year, the world's more than 1 billion Catholics were surprised and shocked when Pope Benedict XVI, born Joseph Ratzinger, announced his resignation. He was elected after the death of Pope John Paul II in 2005. But Benedict said he was getting old and couldn't handle the papacy anymore. Benedict would remain as Pope Emeritus. The question was, who would be the next pope? Cardinals from around the world were summoned for the secret election, with candidates from Asia, Africa, and Latin America the front-runners. With most of the Catholic faithful living in these continents, it wasn't too much of a surprise when in March the Church celebrated the election of Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio of Argentina as the new pope. He's the first Jesuit and the first non-European in modern times to lead the world's Catholics. Unlike other recent pontiffs, Pope Francis doesn't have a numeral after his name. That's because he's the first to take the name Francis. He wanted to honor St. Francis of Assisi, an admirer of nature and a servant to the poor and destitute. He also chose to live in an apartment instead of an archbishop's palace, passed on a chauffeured limousine, and cooks his own meals. February was also eventful for South Africa when one of its biggest sports stars became embroiled in a murder scandal. Oscar Pistorius had overcome his disability to become the world's best-known Paralympian with lots of gold medals and world records to his name. He even represented South Africa at the 2012 London Olympics, and his artificial limbs earned him the nickname Blade Runner. But all the glory and fame was quickly forgotten when his model girlfriend, Reeva Steenkamp, was found dead at his home. Pistorius claimed he shot her by accident, thinking there was an intruder in the house. But police formally charged the star athlete with her murder in late February. Pistorius will also face extra gun-related charges when he goes on trial for murder next year in March. And February was also when North Korea decided to test more nuclear weapons. Pyongyang had already been angered by a UN resolution in January condemning its satellite launch. The nuclear test quickly triggered the usual round of condemnations, with the United States and its allies South Korea and Japan vocal in their displeasure. Even China, one of Pyongyang's few remaining allies, expressed its concern. Things got even more tense when the US and South Korea staged a series of high-profile military drills in March. It was intended as a warning to Pyongyang not to try anything stupid. For a while, Pyongyang would not back down from its hostile rhetoric. It declared that a state of war existed between it and South Korea. The U.S. said it was fully prepared to defend itself and its allies against a North Korean attack. Seoul also blamed Pyongyang for a cyber attack in late March. In another high-profile move, Pyongyang pulled all of its workers out of the Kaesong Industrial Zone, jointly run by the two Koreas. For a while, the world held its breath, wondering whether war would break out. But cooler heads started to prevail, with China and others pushing for negotiations to pull everyone back from the brink. It started a long process that eventually saw the Kaesong Park reopened in September. North Korea shocked the world again in December when it executed the powerful uncle of leader Kim Jong-un for allegedly plotting against the regime. But it wasn't just worries about North Korea. Other tensions simmered in the Asia-Pacific region, most notably over a set of islands known as the Diaoyus in China and Senkakus in Japan. They're controlled by Japan, but Beijing says they belong to China. Taiwan is another claimant, just to add to an already complicated situation. Military escalation continued into 2013. The two sides sent ships and planes into the area. In February, Japan's defense minister revealed a Chinese frigate had locked weapons targeting radar onto a Japanese destroyer and helicopter on 2 occasions in January. Chinese state media responded their frigates had been engaged in routine training at the time. In February, U.S. intelligence detected China moving ballistic missiles closer to the coast near the disputed islands. Tensions resurfaced later in the year. In October, China's Ministry of Defense reacted angrily to Japanese threats that Japan would shoot down any unmanned Chinese drone in its airspace. Military officials in Beijing declared that China would consider such action an act of war. Then in November, China extended its air defense zone to include the Diaoyus, a move which Tokyo denounced as a provocation. In the Middle East, a breakthrough which could see better relations between Iran and the West, while Egypt saw fresh turmoil that ended with its president imprisoned. But we begin in Syria, where one of the most horrific incidents of its brutal civil war shocked the world into action. Late August, and another day in a brutal civil war which has already claimed more than 100,000 lives in Syria. But this day would shake the world out of its inertia because of the horror that unfolded. Reports quickly emerged of a sarin gas attack on a rebel-held area near Damascus. It wasn't the first time rumors of chemical weapon use had surfaced, but the evidence this time was overwhelming. Pictures of dead and dying men, women, and children in the dozens went viral and were shown all over the world. Soon, the war of words began. The rebels blamed the regime of President Bashar al-Assad, saying his forces launched a sarin gas attack out of desperation to stop a rebel advance on the Syrian capital. But Assad claimed it was the rebels who deliberately used chemical weapons to frame his government and drag the United States into the war. European powers such as France and Britain were convinced it was Assad and began lobbying Washington that a strong response was needed. The Obama administration was cautious at first, mindful of the American people's reluctance involved in yet another war. But in the days and weeks that followed, Washington began to harden its tone, sending warships to the region and making clear it was thinking of action.
The United States presented a powerful case that the Syrian government was responsible for this attack on its own people.
Syria's major ally, Russia, looked on with dismay as the West beat the drum of war, warning a military strike would only make a messy situation worse. Other countries sympathetic with Syria, like Iran and China, also expressed their concern about the West's rush to respond with force. UN inspectors were allowed in to assess the situation, with Russia leading a diplomatic effort to buy more time, while a probe established what happened, what gas was used, and who might be responsible. Meanwhile, Britain, so quick to call for strong response, found its effort to punish Assad collapse after Parliament voted against a motion to use military force in Syria. The vote made the White House think twice, with Obama saying he would take the case to Congress before deciding on a military response. Then, a diplomatic breakthrough. A seemingly casual remark by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry that Assad could make amends if he gave up his chemical weapons. By the end of September, an agreement had been reached, under which Syria would declare its entire stockpile and have all weapons either destroyed or removed by the middle of 2014. Inspectors began arriving in October to ensure the regime would follow through. Still, peace in Syria seemed a distant goal, as rebel factions and the government still struggle for survival. The summer of 2013 was also a momentous one for Egypt. Things had not been smooth sailing for the country's first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi, since taking office in 2012. Many in Egypt were alarmed at the direction the country was taking under Morsi after barely a year as president. Things reached a boiling point at the height of summer. Fed up with his administration and the influence of Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood, hundreds of thousands took to the streets towards the end of June, demanding Morsi step down. With Egypt at breaking point, the army decided to act. At the beginning of July, the army removed Morsi and his administration from power. Yet another interim government was installed. But that wasn't the end of Egypt's problems. Morsi supporters and Muslim Brotherhood launched waves of demonstrations, which once again threatened to plunge Egypt into turmoil. Authorities cracked down hard, dispersing pro-Morsi supporters with violence. Hundreds were killed in the summer of rage that swept through Egypt. Many of Morsi's supporters were either killed, forced underground, or imprisoned. By September, the situation had calmed somewhat, but things still remained tense. Morsi is due to stand trial for his alleged misdemeanors in office, another potential flashpoint for this strategically important country. Meanwhile, Egyptians are looking ahead to yet more elections, but many will be asking themselves, will this really change anything? The usual concerns over Iran's nuclear program lingered in 2013, but it was the end of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's term as president, which got people wondering whether relations between Tehran and the West would soften. Certainly, the election of Hassan Rouhani gave rise to cautious optimism. Seen as a moderate, compared with his predecessor, he made all the right noises, condemning the Holocaust, while offering an olive branch to Europe and arch-enemy, the United States. The overture was taken up by President Barack Obama, who personally spoke to Rouhani on the phone. It was the first telephone conversation between leaders of the two countries in more than 30 years. Obama also instructed Secretary of State John Kerry to initiate fresh talks over Tehran's nuclear program. After weeks of negotiations, a major deal was announced at the end of November.
After intensive negotiations, we reached agreement today on a joint plan of action, which sets out an approach towards reaching a long-term, comprehensive solution.
Nuclear activity would be suspended for 6 months in exchange for some relief from crippling economic sanctions. Diplomats say it gives both sides time to work out a more comprehensive agreement. The goal is to prevent Iran from developing atomic weapons while still meeting the country's nuclear needs. Coming up after the break, events in Africa, including an attack on a Kenyan shopping mall. Plus, saying goodbye to some major world figures, including the most famous of them all, Nelson Mandela.